Welcome to the campus of North Idaho College and today's broadcast of the North Idaho College Public Forum. The crew is comprised of North Idaho College television students. Your moderator is North Idaho College political scientist Tony Stewart.
Ladies and gentlemen, we wish to welcome you to the fourth in our 5-week series on the topic Nuclear War, the Dangers and Realities. On this fourth program, we wish to pursue the issue, the medical consequences of a nuclear war. In order to accomplish that task, it is my very special privilege to welcome to our program Dr. James R. McGrath, who is a practicing physician in Seattle, Washington. His present location is at the Bellevue Clinic in Bellevue, Washington. He is also a member of the tending staff at the Children's Orthopedic Hospital in Seattle and the Overlake Hospital in Bellevue. He is a clinical assistant professor of pediatrics at the University of Washington and an advisor on this subject to various organizations in the area. Our guest holds a BA degree from Doane College in Nebraska and a BS and MD degree, each from the University of Chicago. He is presently a member of the Organization of Physicians for Social Responsibility. Dr. McGrath, it's a very special pleasure to welcome you to our program.
Thank you very much, Tony. I've enjoyed being here.
I'm happy to welcome, too, as always, the regular panelist who assists me and has been doing so for so many years, to commence our questioning, Mary Lou Reed.
Thank you, Tony. Dr. McGrath, would you tell us first what your organization, the Physicians for Social Responsibility, is hoping to accomplish? What is your mission?
Our mission at this point is education, the feeling being that all of us, faced with a threat as enormous, as monstrous, as that of nuclear annihilation, need to know in detail what it is that we're afraid of, what it is we're talking about, and what the final consequences of all our other discussions about it come down to.
Well, it's a growing organization, I know, and how many members approximately
At this point, nationally, approximately 17,000 members, and something in the order of 500 new members per month.
Well, could you tell us how you personally got involved with this particular organization? What motivated you to become so active?
Well, 2 years ago in Seattle, was held one of the now many day-long symposia on the medical consequences of nuclear war held by Physicians for Social Responsibility. It was a symposium that was announced by mail. I got the mailing, looked at it, tended to dismiss it. My wife, Charlotte, said, "That looks interesting. Don't you think we should go?" And I said, "Well, I suppose we really should." And on the program was John Kenneth Galbraith, whom I admire and wanted to hear, and so we did. This was 8 hours in a dark auditorium with a crystal clear day outside, such as we have here today, listening to things that were so overwhelming, so frightening, that one could certainly have been left a grease spot on the floor and unable to function thereafter. Fortunately, the seminar didn't do that and did proceed to pick us up and empower us with both the motivation and some of the knowledge and inspiration to proceed to do something about a threat which most of us tend to deny, as I was doing before that day. It was so intense, the reaction to that day, that one could almost liken it to a religious conversion. One simply knew at that point that there was no other single thing in this life that was so important to do as to spread the information that was given that day to as many people as we could.
Dr. McGrath, many individuals are not aware yet, and this, your purpose is to inform them about what would happen in case of that unthinkable attack of nuclear weapons. Would you, maybe in our own locality of Seattle or the Spokane area, give us some indication of different types of attack or numbers of bombs, and what they would do in the blast area, and then beyond that, and what part of the population we would lose.
One has to perhaps go over briefly what the effects of a nuclear explosion are, and the destructive effects are due to blast and heat and radiation. And quite apart from health effects, electromagnetic pulse, which is another consequence not directly related to medical effects. Electromagnetic pulse refers to a brief but very intense burst of energy which can destroy communication systems, computers, telephone systems, radio sending and receiving equipment and the like. But blast after a nuclear explosion produces a dense, compressed wall of air, a wave of power traveling at supersonic speeds, and destroying buildings and bridges and trees and automobiles and everything in the path. With this and following this come dynamic pressures or winds up to 400 miles an hour, higher than that at the center of ground zero, which also blow down structures, blow concrete away from steel frames, blow down trees, pick up people, hurl objects into whatever may be in the path. The overpressures have as little as half pound per square inch, and we're referring now to distances as great as beyond 12 miles from the center of a 1 megaton airburst. A half pound per square inch will shatter glass into little shards, which are driven then at speeds well over 100 miles an hour into people or whatever objects are there. Heat is actually produced first. The first thing that happens when a nuclear weapon explodes is a sudden, intense burst of light and heat. Within less than a second, a 1 megaton burst produces a fireball 1.5 miles in diameter with temperatures exceeding those on the surface of the sun. This travels with the speed of light, igniting buildings and their contents, everything flammable, and within a radius of 5 miles from such a burst, producing third-degree burns, massive third-degree burns of anyone in the open, and up to 6 miles, second-degree burns, up to 7 miles, first-degree burns. And in addition to blast and heat, radiation damage separates this kind of explosion from ordinary conventional explosions. Radiation is harder to define in that it depends so much on whether it's an air burst or a ground burst and on weather and wind conditions at the time. Someone 10 miles away may receive minimal doses of radiation. Someone 100 miles away may have lethal doses of radiation with a ground burst and a modest wind. The effects in Seattle, for example, of a 1 megaton burst at 8,000 feet, if we take a weekday during working hours with the resulting firestorm, 36% of the 1,213,000 people in that area would be killed outright, 440,000 people, and this would seriously injure and incapacitate another 30%, 360,000 people, so that with a single 1 megaton burst, 800,000 casualties, 2/3 of the population either dead or severely injured. And at least 10,000 of those survivors will have massive third-degree burns. Now, in our Seattle area, we have in all 40 burn beds for the entire metropolitan region. And in an acute severe catastrophe, could take care of 25 new acute severe burn patients. In the entire country, there are something in the vicinity of 2,000 to 3,000 burn beds, and acute new burn patients, 200 to 300 could be cared for at one time. This is in the entire United States. Now, in a 1 megaton airburst at 8,000 feet over Spokane would kill instantly 170,000 people and would injure and incapacitate another 52,000. These are the figures from the Arms Control and Disarmament Agency as their estimates were made in 1979. A 20 megaton burst over Spokane would kill outright 250,000 people. One has to remember, of course, that we're talking about single bursts, and in any realistic all-out exchange, there would be many, many megatons, so that we're being unrealistically conservative. We have to recall the Fairchild Air Force Base is nearby, that there are 2 aluminum plants in direct contiguous location, and that these are targeted also. The wind drift, I understand, is from the west. This would tend to bring radiation in the direction of Coeur d'Alene, where we are now. One has to remember also that when Mount St. Helens blew with a 6 megaton blast, fortunately the fallout was not radioactive, and yet Ritzville got large amounts. I understand Coeur d'Alene had a 1/4 of an inch or so of fallout from that explosion, and Hanford is in somewhat of that same vicinity. It is a prime target, and one needs to remember that a nuclear explosion on a nuclear reactor increases the destructive power 1,000 times. The amount of radiation is considerable, of course, and might well drift in this way. I wish I could say that Coeur d'Alene was not to be involved in this. Unfortunately, no one can be uninvolved in this.
Louis.
Well, this is, of course, almost incomprehensible, and you said earlier that there can be then no medical response to this kind of explosion. There would be no way that the medical community could really deal with this. Is that? Would you like to expand on your feelings there?
I think we need to look at what would happen medically if there were this kind of attack.
Yes, the medical effects upon people, actually.
Yes. And the medical consequences are almost incomprehensible in number and variety. There's massive trauma, mixtures of crush injuries and ruptured internal organs, skull fractures, penetrating wounds of the chest and abdomen, fractures of the spine and long bones, and deep lacerations, and massive hemorrhage and shock, and massive 2nd and 3rd degree burns. The estimate is that within cities, about 1,700 survivors would be present for each surviving physician. And if we simplify that and make it easier for that surviving physician and say there are just 1,000 survivors for each physician, and each physician saw each patient once for 10 minutes and worked 20 hours a day, in Seattle area it would take 8 days to see each patient only once. In the Spokane area, somewhere in the vicinity of 3 days. And this is, of course, talking about physicians of all ages and all levels of health, all areas of training, doctors who haven't seen blood for years, and is assuming that they would all be willing to expose themselves to radiation in full measure. And it assumes also that they wouldn't be spending any time on those who were not injured and those who were mildly injured and those who were ill from other causes. And all of that would go on when there is no electricity and no remaining transportation system, no what's left of the buildings, as Dr. Jack Geiger says, is lying in what's left of the streets. Bridges are gone, there's no effective communication system, there are no ambulances, and no hospitals. And during that 10-minute visit, care must be given without pain medications, without antibiotics or other drugs, without x-rays or other diagnostic equipment, without plasma or blood or fluids, and without beds and without operating equipment. Now, clearly, this is not medical care at all. This is simply bizarre absurdity. And we need to see this as an illustration of what would happen to all the other functions of our society. Not only do we lose in a few moments' time all of the support structure of communication and transportation and power and shelter and food and water, but all the complex network of human enterprises which these physically sustain. At 1 hour of one day, the entire community, social and commercial, political, administrative, intellectual, and artistic fabric of our common life is gone. And any population-targeted attack, of course, would involve many multi-megaton weapons. And with the destruction of the social and emotional fabric of our life, survival, it has been said, is in purely biologic terms. And as has been noted, the survivors would envy the dead. Thousands more, of course, would die each week. Insects are better able to resist radiation effects than we, and would proliferate very rapidly, and would aid in the spread of epidemics across a landscape of decomposing human and animal corpses and ashen rubble. And of course, whatever food remained would be very rapidly depleted, and in an all-out exchange, no more would be likely to come. There would be severe water shortages. What water was available would be of questionable potability. And then late effects, and those effects on people affected downwind at a greater distance, include malignancy and genetic mutations. And for those who are exposed in utero, impaired growth and development.
I think you probably should explain that. You're talking
in utero,
about, yes,
babies who are not
unborn.
yet born,
Yes.
would be subject to impaired growth and development and microcephaly and mental retardation. This was the experience in Hiroshima and Nagasaki after those atomic bombings. And then a further health effect that comes down the road a little depends on weather changes. And these are somewhat debated, but it's likely that the heat of the explosion would form nitrogen oxides, which would be injected into the stratosphere by the explosion, and would aid in the breakdown of ozone to molecular oxygen. We depend on the ozone layer to screen us from ultraviolet radiation. As ozone is broken down, even as little as 20% of the total ozone layer, we would be exposed to such increases of ultraviolet radiation that it would have cancer-forming effects on skin and eventual blindness from corneal damage, not only for people, but we must remember also for day-living and land-dwelling animals. And a blind animal, of course, is a dead animal. And so this is a major interruption in the food chain and the ecologic system of the Earth.
Dr. McGrath, something else that you have discussed with us today that's most interesting, I know that from other guests we've had, that when an individual finds out they have a terminal illness, they go through a process reacting to that news. All of us have lived with this threat most of our life now, and some of us all of our life. What are some of the reactions that you see in the population today to try to avoid facing this particular issue?
Well, I have to confess that I see them not only in the population, but certainly in myself. All of us face these. To some extent, the acknowledgement of the reality of this is dealt with in the same way that we deal with grief. And one has to go through a fair period of depression in facing this. I know that I did. And in working to educate myself enough to talk about it, I had some very, very low periods. But the roadblocks to action include, for one thing, unreality. This is so bizarre that it simply seems we can't take it into ourselves. And in doing so, we do lead a double life. We have to, on the one hand, live with the knowledge that at any moment of any day, this world that we live in around us could be gone. And yet at the same time, we have to go on each day, and we get up and we brush our teeth and we eat our breakfast and we go about our daily activities as though this didn't exist. So that we do at the same time lead a double life. The emotional cost of this is tremendous, and the creative energy that would be released did we not have to do this would be of tremendous value.
It's also protective, though, however, is it's not a self-protective.
Awfully important, and we can't strip away from ourselves or from anyone else these defenses without providing some way of living them with this knowledge. And the second, so unreality is one thing, and the second element is denial. Nobody's going to be crazy enough to push the button is our thought, or it's simply too awful to think about. Adaptation, anything that's around long enough, we tend to get used to, and it becomes old hat. Assimilation, we begin to think of these as the same as the old weapons. Once upon a time in 1945, they simply stupefied the world. Everybody said there can never be another world war. And at this point, we begin to talk about these as though they were simply conventional armaments, 1980s style. Ethnocentricity, which means that each side ascribes to the other side all of the bad beliefs and characteristics and behaviors, and to his own side all of the good characteristics and beliefs and behaviors. We all do this all the time, of course, but we need to recognize what we're doing, too. Distancing, button pushing, it's so easy. It's not so easy. It is easier to push a button which may destroy millions, tens of millions of people if one is not standing face to face with those people. The inability to contemplate one's own death is another roadblock, and especially the annihilation of mankind. Outmoded assumptions are another roadblock standing in our way of action. Such outmoded beliefs as that war is winnable, and we're talking about a general world war. That war could be an instrument of politics or a mechanism for settling disputes. And last of all, I think perhaps the biggest roadblock is a sense of impotence. What can an ordinary person do? A sort of leave it to the experts kind of feeling. They have all the information, they have all the basis for making a judgment. Surely they can do the best thing for us. But at this point, I feel that we must involve ourselves. The experts are no more expert when it comes to the end of human history than you and I, nor do they have more to say about it. But then one says to oneself, how does one proceed then? Well, first of all, I think it's important to recognize that there is no one best way of action. Fortunately, as this has begun to work within the population in the last few years, all kinds of creative and wonderful ideas about ways of helping to educate have turned up. We have to remember that nobody is in charge, and nobody's going to tell us what to do, which is fortunate because one tends to sit back if you feel that somebody else is going to tell you what to do. First of all, I think that one has to inform himself, and in simply watching and listening to this presentation, you are doing that, and for that I applaud you. But there are many, many books which are available. Helen Caldicott's Nuclear Madness, very small, paperback, easily readable. The Day After Doomsday, How to Stop Nuclear War, a handbook by Judith Lipton and David Barish, excellent background information, easily readable. And many publications. The Union of Concerned Scientists has a monthly publication, which is excellent. Join one or more organizations. This kind of thing is so devastating that it is tremendously helpful to have the moral support of people around you. And don't just join, but commit time. And one could start out with a little bit, say 5% of your discretionary time, 2 hours a week perhaps. And let others know of your concern, because you can be very sure that in the back of their minds is the same terror and the same worry as in the back of yours. Consider directions of giving money. All of us have favorite concerns and issues and organizations, but we have to remind ourselves that if we don't get a handle on this issue, those other concerns simply won't exist. Make your views clear to elected officials. Simply express direct, clear feelings and thoughts, and remember that in general, it can be very simple, very brief. You don't have to know everything in order to write, and remind them that this is the number one issue on which you will grade them at election time. get local and state and federal officials involved. You probably are aware, 446 New England town meetings have approved the freeze resolution. 232 city councils, 52 county councils, 18 state legislative bodies all have endorsed the freeze proposal. Organize a discussion group session. It need not be a college and a massive effort. It can be a neighborhood discussion session. Work for specific and realistic objectives. And at the moment, perhaps the most realistic, the most specific and immediate is a nuclear freeze resolution in the Congress. Get out and be counted. And this is something new for most of us in Middle America. We don't tend to march in the streets, and we don't tend to make a big uproar. But in this case, with human survival at stake, it's time for us to get out and be counted too.
Can you say a little bit more about the psychological toll that this has taken, particularly on children? I understand that the concern about the nightmares of children is something that's mounting more and more as it is understood that children are very, very scared right now. What do you advise parents to do, to say, to handle this question of immediate fear?
Whenever it's been looked at, children have been found to be very much aware of the nuclear threat and very much concerned by it and very anxious about it. I think that as with death, we tend to avoid the subject with our children, partly because we don't quite know what to say. And as a matter of fact, all of us are feeling our way about how best to deal with this with children. There is, I think, a certain element of this fear involved in some of the bizarre behavior, bizarre from our standpoint, of the behavior of some of the youth today. Punk rock, for example, would not be comprehensible to me except in these terms. If you are reasonably convinced that you have no future, that your life is brief and consists only in the sensations of this moment, perhaps the punk movement is not that bizarre, not that hard to understand. I think that in dealing with the issue with children, it's the same as all other anxiety-producing, fearsome issues. It helps children as well as it helps us to acknowledge the fear and to know that we aren't alone.
Get it out in the open.
For them to know that they aren't alone and to have it be a subject of conversation. This can come up when there are things on the news.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but we're out of time, and I wish we could go on. Thank you so much. Our guest has been Dr. James McGrath, who has really done an outstanding job discussing this very important topic to us. I hope you'll be with us again next week at this very same time, and we'll finish this 5-week series. Please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
The North Idaho College Public Forum can be seen at this same time each week over this station. This production was videotaped earlier by a North Idaho College student crew for viewing at this more appropriate time. To the campus of North Idaho College and today's broadcast of the North Idaho College Public Forum. The crew is comprised of North Idaho College television students. Your moderator is North Idaho College political scientist Tony Stewart.
Ladies and gentlemen, we were happy to welcome you to the 5th and final week of our series on the topic Nuclear War, the Dangers and Realities. Today we have 2 distinguished guests, and I'm going to make the introduction very brief so we have plenty of time for both of those persons to fill the questions. First of all, we have Dr. Richard T. McSorley, who is a professor of theology at Georgetown University. Our second guest is Congressman Larry Craig from the 1st Congressional District of Idaho, serving his second term in the United States House of Representatives. Joining me in questioning our guest on the issue of public policy and ethics concerning the nuclear arms race, I welcome to the panel, first of all, Father Bill Wasmuth from the St. Pius Catholic Church in Coeur d'Alene, and regular panelist Lou Reed, and we'll invite Father Bill to commence the question.
We have to keep the question short, too, so we can get as much from both of you as possible. I guess, Father McSorley, I'd like to ask you first, if you have had the chance, or if you would have the chance to speak directly to the Congress or to the President, and you had to give them a brief message from the gospel, what the gospel would be saying in relation to American foreign policy around war, around nuclear armament, I should say, rather than war, what would you say?
Well, I would say that the nuclear technology makes it clear that if we neglect the teaching of love your enemy of the gospel, that we are finished, that there is no other alternative, humanly speaking, open to us. Technology has outdone the possibility of war solving any of our problems, and scientists and military men are quite willing to admit that. So that if we refuse the alternative that Christ gives us in the gospel, which is love your enemies, treat everyone as a brother and sister, relate what means you're using to the goal you're seeking, and imitate Jesus' suffering service of each other. If you want to put that aside, do it at your own peril. But that's the direction in which we're going. And I think that I don't think that any Christian can go in that direction if they want to follow the gospel.
Mary Lou Reed.
Well, gentlemen, to pursue this a little further, the simple question is, does increased defense spending for additional nuclear weapons increase or decrease our national security? Now, Father McSorley has said earlier that it is a lie to say that we are defending ourselves by making more weapons. Congressman Craig, how would you respond to that?
Mary Lou, I suspect it has to relate on where that money is going. If it's to build new weaponry, then probably the Father's right. If it's to maintain what you have based on a current policy that is acceptable worldwide, that has served and is perceived to serve as a balance, a deterrent in the mix of things, then maybe not.
What do you mean by maintain? Do you mean by spending more money in order to maintain?
Oh, it's like
old weapons or new weapons?
it's like trading off the 1953 Chevy for the 1983.
So you believe
It's
that
called
we should...
modernization, current, state-of-the-art.
Father McSorley, could you respond to that? How do you feel about the issue of modernization?
Well, I think it's false to say that deterrence is a way to peace. It's a trap in which humanity finds itself. While we talk of deterrence for 30 years or 37 years, we hate each other more. We are building more and more weapons. The weapons are spreading around the world. The poor are starving around the world. The gap between the rich and the poor nations are growing, and we are facing the chasm ahead, rushing to it more swiftly. Deterrence is not saving us from war. We've had 145 wars since World War II, and each one threatens nuclear war, and one of them will finally do it.
Congressman Craig, can you make a moral defense for deterrence?
You know, Mary Lou, I've never tried to argue morality in an immoral world. Can't make a moral argument for what we do.
Would you like to try?
No.
I have a question concerning the issue that both of you have spoken to today, and you both in your speeches made it very, very clear that nuclear war, if it was all out between the United States, would be destructive to the human race, maybe to the entire planet. And you both obviously, in most strong terms, oppose that ever happening. Where we come down now, and that's what this symposium has been basically about, is how do we most constructively go about preventing that day from coming. And I would appreciate if both of our guests would take a few minutes to express, for the various plans you've seen and the alternatives, what would you recommend to the people of America to try to prevent that Holocaust from ever happening? Congressman Craig, you wish to start?
Tony, to the symposium this morning, I talked about the theory behind the strategy of mutual assured destruction that we have operated under as a nation for about 20 years. And I said that I believed it was a false premise, and that had driven us to the point that we are today, in a nuclear arms race that is destabilizing and that is potentially very dangerous to humanity. But I don't wish to back away from the very valid argument that we have found historically the need to defend ourselves for the purpose of providing for our freedom and our security. That is necessary in the presence of an opposing force that does not hold the same beliefs, the same ethical or religious background or understanding that we have. And that's really part of the problem where we are. It becomes a question, I think, of what then do we defend ourselves with, and is it adequate?
Do you think that we presently are doing that, or do you think there needs to be any change to, in other words, Congressman, what would you recommend would be the most specific and safe way to prevent nuclear weapons from ever being used?
Obviously, the elimination of them. Now, because they are a major factor in that strategy that currently is adhered to by a majority of people in Congress and the Defense Department and basically worldwide as it comes to deterrence. How do you get away from the strategy, and how do you withdraw nuclear weaponry, if you will, from that approach? You obviously devise something different. And that was what I discussed with the symposium. My surprise, I guess simply because I had been so embroiled in it that I accepted it and was excited about it, and I expected the rest of the country to be, when our president the other evening took a major departure away from MAD to a new concept, and nobody heard him. And it was the most peaceful statement, in my opinion, as relates to humanity and the potential destruction of mankind that's been made by a president probably since Eisenhower said, "Beware of the military-industrial complex." But nobody applauded. They were too busy going to peace rallies. And yet it was a peaceful statement.
You're speaking of the space...
I'm talking about the high frontiers concept, the concept that we can now, through technology, render ICBMs with nuclear warheads on them basically useless. We are told, and I believe we have that capability, we have the capability, if you will, of kind of shrouding our nation in a cloak of protection based on electronics and a variety of sophistications that was not capable before. Is that an answer? I don't know that. I can't tell you that that's an answer. I can tell you that it appears to be an alternative. And as an alternative, it has the capability of moving us away from mutual assured destruction, and the basis of that concept or theory being nuclear deterrent.
Father McSorley, you too addressed this same issue today, and you were very emphatic that we could destroy ourselves and that there was tremendous power on both the Soviet Union and the United States side concerning nuclear arsenal. What would be your plan to humanity to try to prevent this day from destroying life?
Well, I'd say that my plan is what I consider to be the gospel plan. That our danger is not the weapons. Our danger is our attitude towards each other. Even if we didn't have the nuclear weapons, we could still and have killed each other. It's just a little more ominous now, or much more ominous. But so the direction of change is the direction and change of attitudes. Attitudes towards those people that call themselves our enemies, and our own attitudes towards a mutual attitude. So anything that will put a fire break between our attitudes. The Ground Zero talks about fire breaks, that the main fire breaks between Russia and the United States is negotiations now, one kind or another, but they're not going very far. They don't look like they're going anywhere. I think that the solution is proportionate to the willingness of individuals to suffer for what they believe. I think that is the example of the gospel. That's the example of Christ. He showed us that by taking the suffering on himself, that's the Christian belief, that he redeemed us. He took the suffering. And so he invites us, the gospel invites us, to bear one another's burdens, to take the cross, to take the suffering. And the people who are doing that are the people who are saying no to nuclear weapons in every way. Politicians, people who refuse to pay taxes for war, people who go into nuclear plants and violate a law which cloaks with legality an immoral program of building nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons are immoral, they're illegal, and even United States law validates those who destroy them. So I think that people like Father Dan Berrigan and Father Jim Douglas in the Trident base, who are going to jail regularly and giving a witness of their willingness to suffer for their conviction that this is evil, have an influence. And I would just add that the political effect of this, or the larger effect, is that among the United States bishops, the 65 or so peace bishops are there where there are people in their diocese who are, out of a basis of faith, willing to suffer. Number one among them is Bishop Hunthausen, who has been very much impressed by what Jim Douglas has done. He said, there's a man who comes to me, asks me nothing, but I know he's gone to jail for his faith. I know that he's going to go back to jail for his faith. And Jim Douglas himself sees himself as a gospel follower. So I think that if we want to turn away the nuclear weapons, that's fine. But if we're going to do it, leave God out of it, we'll get nowhere. I think that I don't see any solution in the high frontier at all. I think that we don't have the technology for it, and that even if it worked, if we had the technology, it could be subverted very easily. There's lots of ways of upsetting it.
Father Bill. Congressman, I've just been learning more about this during this last week, but it seems, and I think you alluded to it this morning too, it seems that our foreign policy in terms of how we treat people that we think are our enemies or that we know are our enemies has been based around a threat strategy that we can do more harm to you than you can do to us, ultimately. And as I understand from the other day, that threat has been utilized 7, 8, 9 times since World War II in a serious manner. Most visible one probably the Cuban Missile Crisis during Kennedy's time. Maybe we learn to live that way as nations and even as individual people when we get into a win-lose or power struggle kind of thing. But even if you hold on to that right now, it seems to me that there is no possibility that kind of threat strategy can continue to work. When you have potential on both sides to perform so much destruction, how can you say to each other, I can hurt you more than you can hurt me? How can you say to each other, stop your action or I will hurt you and I can hurt you more than you can hurt me? It just doesn't seem like it's a feasible kind of approach anymore, that it just is not a workable kind of thing, that we can't deal with enemy in terms of threats when we have the kind of nuclear power that we have now. So it seems to me we have to do a foreign policy kind of change here as well as a nation. It's the whole attitudinal kind of change to our foreign policy. Is any thought going on about that in Congress? Or in your mind, either one? Take your pick.
Not a great deal. Obviously, the debate that is now ongoing on the floor of the House as it relates to the nuclear freeze, it at times alludes to it, certainly not in the way and in the premise that you've put it. I guess my frustration comes when I look at mankind's existence on this globe. His preservation has always been based on threat. If I have something you want and you're bigger than I am, 5,000 years ago, you took it away from me. And your threat was your strength. I'm not saying it's right. I'm in no way condoning that. Mm-hmm. I'm saying that is the nature of mankind, it appears to me. Now our threats are much more ominous and a great deal more sophisticated. And when we talk about a balance of power, what we're really talking about is a relative balance of threat. Are we discussing that and looking at alternatives at this time? No, because I suspect that mankind finds it somewhat incapable of thinking, at least in the broad sense, about different kinds of ideas as it relates to what is almost innate in the system of man, and that's the threat business.
Don't we have to? Doesn't it seem like we don't have any
I'm
choice?
certainly willing to, but right now I have no alternatives other than some that I've suggested, but they're still based on threat. It's just that they, in this case, and I wish Father wouldn't summarily discharge it, at least in this case, it doesn't involve people. There's a difference between in people and weaponry.
I'd be very glad to give more details on it if you want.
Yeah. Well, I'm talking about the idea of high frontiers.
I'm talking about that too. I mean,
I think there's a lot of difference between wiping out a city of people and being able to block weaponry coming in with other weaponry so that you don't wipe out the people. I just think that's a lot of difference.
But whether you do something like that or whatever kind of system you use, it seems to me we're still locked into the threat strategy. They can threaten us because they can get past our high frontiers. We can threaten them because they can't get past our high frontiers. We're still into that threat strategy. And it seems to me that that's a losing battle, that sooner or later, and more than likely sooner, either through a mistake or through somebody making a threat that the other one isn't going to back down from, nor are we going to back down from it, as we, now so far enemies have backed down when we threatened. What's going to happen the first time they don't? Do they really believe that if we threaten any more?
There are two alternatives at that point.
Either we don't
back down or there is a war.
Then if we back down the first time, that's going to end our strategy.
Of some kind of a war.
Why don't we change our strategy before we have to back down? Because if we back down once, then that strategy doesn't work anymore.
I can't answer that question for you, Father. In the real sense, I can't. You know, it's kind of like saying your church is secure today not because you love everybody in Coeur d'Alene, but because the police protect the church. So that if somebody breaks in, or the threat of the police catching them if they break in and steal something out of your church home or your church house, there's a threat in your own security.
Lou Reed.
Can we talk a little bit more about this whole issue of the nuclear freeze? I think that what we're reflecting is that there is just a growing, as everyone knows, a growing movement throughout the country in which people are saying we are afraid, we do not want to have our future this endangered. One way that we see of sending messages to both Russia and to ourselves is to have a nuclear freeze. As I understand it, Congressman, you are in opposition to this position.
I am in opposition to the current position being debated. I am in favor of a nuclear freeze. And I always have been.
Yes, and what kind of freeze would you support?
I would support a mutual, verifiable freeze in which I could be totally assured that at the time this nation went into a freeze posture, that the Soviet Union were doing so.
It is our understanding that Russia has said that they would indeed endorse a mutually verifiable freeze.
They've said it twice in the last 2 decades.
Father McSorley, what do you think we should do to look for non-military solutions, which is what I think Father Bill is seeking?
Well,
in relationship to the freeze and the peace movement.
Well, the freeze is just a very surface type of stopping making the nuclear weapons and deploying them now, and it would, even if it was accepted by Congress, which is no likelihood it will because President Reagan's opposed to it and the Senate's opposed to it, even if it was accepted, though, it would take a couple of years before it went into effect, before everything was in order and it was agreed to. So by that time we'd made 2,000 or 3,000 more nuclear weapons each year and maybe have a nuclear war. So that it's good, but it's only a beginning. It would only, if we got a freeze, from there we could start to disarmament. A freeze is not disarmament. We need to get rid of all our nuclear weapons so that a freeze is a minimum type of thing. United States bishops in their third draft changed from curb to, from halt to curb. Now I hear in their new program coming up tomorrow or first and second, they're going to change it back to halt again. I don't think it makes a lot of difference whether you say halt or curb, because I don't think it makes a lot of difference whether the freeze passes. I think it's very important that the freeze be discussed and that it be debated and that the issue of nuclear danger be brought before the Congress and before the people. And I think that that's being done in the debate, and that's probably the best thing that's going to come out of it.
Father, let me applaud you for saying that we ought to be talking about reductions. I have said that for 2 years while the freeze people have been saying, no, we don't want to talk about reductions, we want to talk about freezes, not reductions in armaments. If, in fact, we have enough nuclear hardware to kill ourselves or destroy ourselves 10 times over, then we darn well better be talking about reduction. 1 time over is bad enough to die, and let alone 10 times. So yesterday is a good example, which shows you how convoluted the whole issue can become. When we offered an amendment that we should freeze and reduce, it was defeated by 10 votes because the freeze movement leaders in this House don't want to tolerate that. That's very frustrating.
I think that they have a point for not tolerating it. They're not opposing the reductions, but they just don't want the reductions tied into the freeze. That the freeze is a separate thing. They want reductions will come much better if there is a freeze, and I think that's their argument. It's not a foolish argument, and it's probably politically based that they don't want the Democrats who have the majority in the House now don't want to go on dancing around talking about the freeze vote while the Republicans put more and more amendments onto it. I think that's what's going on. I think everybody who would be for the freeze would also be in favor of the reductions.
I think I must interject here because this show will not air for some time, that we're talking on April the 29th, and when this airs, something will have happened, and I want the viewers to know that you were obviously very aware of that. I'm afraid I may be ending the program on a gloomy note. The symposium has been on that note, I think, and I don't see another way of doing it, so I want to apologize. Both of you have talked very much about the attitude of the people, and I think you've been very articulate in expressing that we, and Father Bill has done this also, that the attitude of the people all over the world has been a rather aggressive one, historically speaking. And that aggression today with this new technology can result in no people left. Some guests that we have had at the symposium, Admiral Carroll, for example, has become so pessimistic, if I'm reading him correctly, that he discussed in the terms that by 1990 we may have that world nuclear war. I was told by some other people that had heard a press release this week from Buckminster Fuller, who was here last year on this program, that he was discussing a very good possibility of war in the next 50 months. These are, like yourself, very bright people who are in the middle of the world of ideas and travel in circles where policies are made. That concerns me to hear such responsible and serious-minded people speaking in those terms. I would like to very much to get both of your reactions. Do you see any positive sign that I'm not observing that the attitude is changing? I'm speaking all over the world, and I'm not trying to direct this at any particular group of people. That may keep us from having that war before we do what both of you are advocating, that is, get rid of the nuclear weapons. Father McSorley, you go first.
The Nobel Prize winner Sean McBride of Ireland, who is a world-famous lawyer now, says that he sees signs all over the world of people telling governments we don't want it. And he doesn't think that governments are ever going to put the weapons aside themselves. But throughout Europe, and even in Soviet Union, and in the United States with 1 million people marching last June, and the freeze itself is a part of it, the people are saying in a lot of ways, we are not going to have it. And if the government doesn't agree in getting rid of them, then we'll have to do something about getting rid of the government. Not just the United States, but get some government in that will do something about it. So that he's very hopeful, and I share that.
Father McSorley, how does one get more pressure on the government of the Soviet Union? Is this message getting through to the general population?
Yes, I attended a meeting in Vienna with non-government people of the East and the West, and for the first time, this about a month ago, the first time the Soviet Union allowed the Russian Orthodox bishops to come out to a meeting to discuss it. Of course, they were opposed to nuclear weapons on the same gospel basis that I'm opposed to it. And in doing it, they saw themselves as supporting their own government. They're much more restricted. It was clear that they didn't have the freedom to talk, but it was clear to me that the Western people that were there, and we had Westerners from the United States, from all Europe, the Westerners who refused to come were the politicians who had, say, Carter administration politicians, people who were out of office now. We didn't want anybody in office, who would feel that if they talked to communists, they would be tarred with being easy on communists. So that we didn't get any big-name Americans, like Paul Warneke was invited and others were invited. So we talk about our freedom, but we refuse to exercise it in many cases where we could. I think that a lot is being done. The United States bishops' move is part of it. All the church groups are doing something about it. I think there's hope there.
Congressman Craig, you meet with people from different parts of the world too, and both in and out of government. do you see any signs of an attitudinal change that may affect all governments in the world? Or do you agree with these other persons who are indicating that we could very possibly have an accident and have this to happen, or are we moving in that direction of more conflict?
I think, Tony, the capability of having an accident has existed ever since I was born, ever since I've lived on this planet. And I really reject the fatalist arguments that a good many people use when it's just around the corner. It's going to happen in 90 days or 120 days or 150 days. It could happen tomorrow. I mean, that is a real possibility when you have online the kind of armaments that we in the Soviet Union have online. If they were to make some kind of a move, an overt move of some type, or if we were, and you know, that kind of thing exists in this world. So it's very difficult to play that kind of game. I think it's a dangerous, scare game to be played that's wrong in doing. I don't currently see a situation in the world, as I observe it at least, that would provoke a war within 90 days or a war by 1990. There are some destabilizing activities going on at this time. They are somewhat central to a limited area, and I don't believe they have the kind of world significance or impact that would cause or spawn the kind of activity that might bring about a nuclear exchange.
I'm so sorry to interrupt. We're out of time, and we could go on for many hours. I know the panel could too. I express appreciation to everyone here for being here today. Ladies and gentlemen, with this, we conclude a 5-week series with you on what has been, I think, the most serious topic that we could have discussed, nuclear war, the dangers and realities. We've had what I believe are 6 experts in the field from many walks of life to discuss this issue. I hope you've enjoyed the program as much as we have been enjoying putting it together and presenting it to you. Next week, we'll commence a different topic. Until that time, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
The North Idaho College Public Forum can be seen at this same time each week over this station. This production was videotaped earlier by a North Idaho College student crew for viewing at this more appropriate time.